안녕하세요. 주영 한국문화원장 선승혜입니다. 오늘은 런던 대학교 수아스의 그레이스 고 교수님을 모시고 한국 문학에 대해서 이야기해 보겠습니다. Hi everybody, I am Seunghye Sun, Director of Korean Culture Center. Today, I am very honored to have a special guest, Dr. Grace Koh, for talking and sharing our ideas and our opinions, our kind of special experience of Korean literature today. Just welcome and Dr. Koh in today. 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. 저는 영국 런던 대학교 소아스에 있는 그레이스 고라고 합니다. Hello, my name is Grace Koh, and I teach Korean literature at SOAS, University of London. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Director Sun for inviting me today.
Grace, and I have 5 questions about Korean literature. Because I am a great fan of Korean literature, always I want to talk more about Korean literature with you. So just I have 5 questions. My first question is the significance of Korean literature in the UK. How do you perceive the evolving significance of Korean literature in the UK? And what aspects of Korean literature has resonated most with British readers? And why do you think there is increasing interest in Korean stories and authors?
So, I get asked this question a lot. So just for to provide you with some context, I've been teaching at SOAS since 2002. So it's been now, 22 years. It's my 22nd year. I can't believe that. And of course, back when I first started, first of all, we didn't have very many students who were studying Korean as part of their degree. We were always a smaller East Asian language degree compared to Chinese or Japanese. And back then, Korea was very, not very well known, I think. At that time, maybe because of North Korea, there was lots of interest in North Korea. But this was just at the beginning of the Korean wave when Korean films were starting to become more visible, especially with the likes of director Park Chan-wook's Old Boy, and some of the films that really made it into the market, still through like a niche kind of audience. And in terms of literature, and I'll be talking about that later. It's partly due to the nature of the primary medium of literature as well, and translation and the time it takes, etc. Anyway, I've seen over the past 20 years, I've seen a huge change in terms of just growing interest in Korean culture. Now, over the past 20 years, the number of students studying Korean at university as part of their undergraduate degree has increased substantially. I think a couple of years ago, we even had maybe like 2 or 3 more students who came in to study Korean than Japanese. That was a big coup at the time. So there have been lots of developments and lots of interests. And during this time, of course, whenever there have been occasions to discuss Korean literature, in the UK at various contexts, this particular question gets asked. I have gotten this question, and it's not a straightforward. It's not a question that I can answer in straightforward terms. I think people would like kind of a simple answer, and I can probably think of one, but I don't like to. So, to be honest with you, this is a question that I sometimes hesitate in answering, not because there isn't an answer as such, but because the question of significance relies on the question of relevance or relatability. And it doesn't just apply to Korean literature in the UK. I'm talking about the medium of literature. I'm talking about Korean culture within the UK market. But it could apply to any sort of form of cultural forms when they travel abroad Why does it become popular? What does it mean to the local audience, the audiences in that country? What is its significance? So I think it's a question that I've kind of tried to grapple with and to try and articulate in clearer terms, because it's one, I think the broader questions about what makes good literature is one that interests me personally, and it's one that I'm still trying to attempt to answer in a clear and articulate manner. But I think first and foremost, and based on my experience of seeing, a time when people hardly knew anything about Korea in this country, unlike in other countries where there are more histories of diaspora communities. In the UK, the Korean diaspora community didn't develop or didn't grow until quite relatively recently. But I think it's, first of all, if we consider the kind of form or the medium of literature, specifically fiction in this case, because it also varies, in terms of fiction, what do people look for? Well, they look to be entertained first and foremost. Storytelling is very important, right? So storytelling is an important factor. And then the second question is the how. So it has to be a compelling narrative. So it has to do with, and I know you're interested in this field, the literary aesthetics. It has to do with the aesthetics. So what makes a good story? What kind of captivates its readers? So it has to do with the literary style and aesthetics, in addition to the content. And I think, and as a result, some of the things, of course, that we benefit as readers, by reading world literature, foreign literature, is we encounter new cultures, we encounter new realities, new worlds. We're moved by it. Like Lee Kwang-soo said in the early 20th century, literature is all about tong. It's about emotions. It shapes our sensibilities. It shapes our sense of empathy, understanding. So this is quite universal. But I think when it comes to that question of what is the significance of Korean literature in the United Kingdom, for example, or anywhere else for that matter, I think the first thing that people, I as a Korean, of course, yes, of course, everyone has to read Korean literature. It's fascinating. It's interesting. I care because I'm a so-called local reader, like you and I, because we have a shared kind of socio-political history, and we have shared cultural traditions, heritage, and literature expresses all that, and there are different trends and developments. And in the case of Korean literature, there are different stages, throughout history. But let's say in the 20th century, there were certain trends coming out of the socio-political realities. But those were the things that really spoke more to Koreans, right? It had more to do with some of the social struggles, or, given Korea's history, many Koreans like to describe it as, and it's true, kind of a traumatic history of the 20th century, with basically a shift, like a new world order, the rise of Japanese imperialism and colonization, and then shortly thereafter, of course, division on the Korean Peninsula, followed by the Korean Civil War, and all that against the backdrop of globalization and the like. So I think even if we haven't necessarily lived through these particular historical periods of time, as I say, it usually takes at least 3 generations to overcome some of the historical traumas. So we share that sense, how these kinds of historical traumas, if you will, have affected the daily lives of people and families and communities, and kind of filtering through the generations. We all live with that in one way or another. So because of that, we, of course, are very much invested in seeing how these stories are told from the perspective that we can understand. But then when it comes to readers abroad, they're not necessarily going to be invested in the same way that Koreans may not be necessarily interested in reading about, well, English literature even, right? Aside from the fact that it's probably taught at school, there might be lots of readers that, may not necessarily want to, but, they do because of education or whatever else. So I think for a while, because of the kinds of literary works that were coming out of Korea, which were much more socially engaged, and because it was a constant fight, struggle, it was what literature did, and it was how it was meaningful for the local readership, so to speak. That was not necessarily relevant for, let's say, British readers, right? So I think for a long time, Korean literature was probably one of, it basically gained traction much later than other cultural forms with the Korean wave that are much more based on audiovisual mediums. Because with those, even with films and television, you have to subtitle, you have to translate, but they take a lot less time to do it, and you have the visual element. So audiences who don't know Korean can still watch, participate, hear. Whereas with literature, the medium of literature is language. So the only way that we're going to be able to share that with a global audience or UK audience in this case specifically is to translate it into English, and that takes a lot longer, and it has a lot of other skills. And I won't go into translation because I know that's one of the questions later on. So I think it was one of the last kind of cultural forms to gain traction, and I still remember around 2014 when South Korea was invited as the market-focused country for the London Book Fair in 2014. And I see that period being very pivotal for Korean literature in the UK because I think it was a very successful event. And even Koreans from LTI Korea, Literature Translation Institute of Korea, KCC, Korean Cultural Center, the Arts Council, who all participated either through funding or through helping with the curation of the program, which was primarily curated by the British Council, and they did a magnificent job. Everyone did. I remember speaking with, I can't remember which director it was. I think it was from the LTI Korea, not director Kim Sung-gun, who also played a very important role, I think. But it was someone else from there who said, literature right now, Korea is on the rise, not only with films, but I think K-pop, popular music, and other things were gaining lots of traction, and literature was still behind. And, Koreans love to promote their culture abroad. They're saying, we feel this is the last sort of area, but obviously it's going to take a while, and it's hard. Everyone talked about how difficult the English language market was to break. And there are lots of people, English people, who would say, yes, and the problem is that UK audiences don't read as much world literature. I personally disagree with that because I think there is, in the UK, kind of dedicated groups of readers who are very interested in world literature and translation. But at any event, I think even at that time, so 2014, and this was just when Deborah Smith, who was a student at SOAS then, and she had just, I think she was finishing up The Vegetarian, and I think at the London Book Fair, she showed me the book cover from the publishers, and it was due to be published in the following year, I think. Even Deborah was saying this because, she also was asked a lot of questions as a translator. And Brother Anthony of Teze in Seoul, who came over, who's also been very supportive of young translators. And we all kind of mentioned how, well, I guess Korean literature from the 20th century, the ones that Koreans felt, yes, these are very important literary works, they might not necessarily appeal to the British public because of their kind of socio-political contexts, which are not relevant, to UK audience members. But then since then, obviously, there have been lots of developments, and as South Korea has developed in different ways. So I think even in terms of works of fiction, you have different strands or different themes or different topics that authors began to write about, which was more related to the day-to-day. So obviously, it is very much rooted in Korean society, but they were sort of stories that perhaps British audiences could pick up and read and feel like, oh, okay, I can relate to this. Because it's not about a particular political situation, but it's about a particular character who I can somehow identify with. And I think it's not just specifically, I don't think it's exclusive to Korean or British context. I think in the age that we live in, with a lot of the technologies and I don't like to use that word, but globalization, a lot of the fiction trends are merging in some ways. So I think it was also to do with that sense of relatability, because similar to when, if you want to go watch a movie, then you choose what you want to watch. You're going to spend, well-earned money on it. So, how does a person choose what they want to watch, right? It has something, they read the blurb, it's to do with their personal tastes, it's to do with what kind of captivates their attention, and it's the same with literature. So what makes a person actually, order a book online or, go into the bookstore and pay for a book, lend it from a library, and then actually take the time to read. So it has to be something that somehow they feel, it's personal taste, but it's also somehow relatable to me, right? So I think that in terms of Korean literature, we can't also ignore the success of Hallyu. Because I think, in as much as we'd like to think that, and I think Korean literature is fantastic and anyone should read it, but without the kind of visibility of Korea and Korean culture generally, especially to younger audiences, people wouldn't have necessarily, been interested, right? But I think it's also to do with the success of all the other different cultural forms, which are audio, kind of visual, media-based, content-based, which audience member were able to access more easily, and which then sort of sparked their interest about South Korea and South Korean culture, and also the way that South Korea has been developing as a country. It's quite impressive. So, after every time I go back, it's different. So much changes. So I think there has to be a general visibility. So as I mentioned, 20 years ago, lots of people didn't know, people would constantly refer to Korea as Southeast Asia, or they assumed it was somewhere south, or it was all about North Korea. But I think certainly the success of the Korean wave or Hallyu, based on other cultural media forms, helps spark that interest. And then especially the younger generation of readers who likes reading would then, look and find out that, there's, Korean literature, fiction. Of course, the success of the Vegetarian International Booker Prize, and once again, the kind of visibility, people saying, what's that book about? And also the London Book Fair, it wasn't just a one-off occasion event, and I remember the Korean organizations were very impressed with the UK at that time. And they told me that they had done a lot of events like this, well, not to the same one, but similar in, let's say, North America, because let's face it, Korea likes to focus on the US, right? I mean, I grew up there, so, but they said, but America's also very big. and much more kind of diverse than people think it is. And so initially they said, oh, we thought this would be yet another event that we host, but something really meaningful apparently came out of it in that they were impressed with the way that the British Council, the UK Publishers Association, the organizers here, they really kind of took it not just to hold an event, but in practical terms, there were a lot of active exchange between the publishing companies and fields. Publishers play a very important role. So it's also a time around the time when the vegetarian was coming out and there were a new generation of translators emerging, publishers began to be interested. And it was UK publishers that it also picked up alongside American ones, some of the more recently famous or popular Korean fiction in translation. So I think there was an important role in that as well. So I think in terms of significance, going back to this question, and I'm so sorry for this long-winded thing, but I guess there's so many different elements involved and I think we as human beings like things to be labeled and, kind of classified. We like to define something unique about particular cultures and the power of that and what's unique about it. A lot of the questions that I got asked and I get asked is, what's unique about Korean literature? Well, there's lots of things that are unique, but I can't just say one thing. It's like, what's unique about English literature? What's unique about French literature? So I think that, so my question is, the question of significance relies on relatability. It relies obviously on, the art, the success, the content, the storytelling, the compelling narrative. In the case of translated fiction, translation, therefore, plays a very important role. But it's also something to do with visibility of a culture in a foreign country, where once we were very little known. Now, we're very popular, we're very popular. I had a meeting with my GP this morning, and even she talked about, she's saying, oh, by the way, I'm obsessed with Korea. She said, she said, oh, I'd love to go there, and I follow, and she's around my age, but she said, oh, but I love all the media content, I love this. And I live in a small town, by the way. I moved out of London. So I think also that kind of visibility as what Koreans call 국력, kind of the rise of it. No, I shouldn't say this in English, but yes, the kind of the way that South Korea has transformed in various different ways. I think all of this we can't sort of ignore, and that has given some levels of significance, to Korean literature for its readers. But as for the individual readers, I'm sure if you ask each and one of them, there will be diverse answers of what they of how what they think was meaningful of a particular Korean literature work from the perspective of a British reader, and there will be many, many different responses to that.
It is from my really just I am quite excited to talk about the literature, Korean literature here in London, because I am a kind of literature fan. Yes, I love first just my experience. I love to read poems. Yeah, but it is when it is anyone ask me what is the kind of my recommendation of Korean novel. It was quite difficult because maybe Nine Dreams and Kumo.
Yes.
Yeah, it is a kind 20 years ago when I start to introduce in Korean culture to a kind of to USA and Europe. But recently, when I arrived here as the director, I am quite surprised. Everybody talks what they read, but it is really the book published quite recently. It means not a kind of traditional one. That is the kind of right now the vegetarians like sometimes I want to die, but I want to have tteokbokki. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I saw.
Yeah.
Yes, I saw.
Sometimes very kind of just in award-winning novel, but sometimes very popular book.
Yes.
But the very obvious thing is the novels I read and the kind of British audience read the same book. Yeah, it is quite impressive moment. I remember in a kind of London book fair, I heard about the story after the kind of Frankfurt book fair and the London book fair was quite successful. Yeah, but always it is quite difficult in what is the literature itself. But we can talk about what is our each people's what is my experience in reading in books. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yes. And you just mentioned now how some people would ask you, oh, what would you recommend, right? I get asked that a lot, and I don't tell them. I say, well, what do you like? Because there's so many that we can recommend. I have my personal favorites, but I don't necessarily like to share or impose because unless if I know them, unless if I know the person very well. But I get asked that a lot by prospective students, for example, and I just tell them, what do you like? What kind of books do you like? Then I can tell you there's so many.
and then the obvious thing is the visibility of a Korean culture is quite. It is sometimes I'm very surprised the visibility of Korean culture. When I was in Korea, I was not experienced like this way. But when I am in London now, just maybe it is just every day I am quite impressed and surprised by the visibility of Korean culture because I look like Korean when I use my Korean language, and people and here in UK just you are Korean, and then they say I watched some dramas and some films, but now and the people talk about the books. Yeah, it is quite the last one because the literature needs translation. Yeah, it is not easy. But now, today is like a dream because we can talk about Korean literature.
Yes.
My second question is defining beauty in Korean literature. My major was aesthetics. So aesthetics explore and study and research about the beauty. We really do our best don't to use the word beauty.
Why?
But I want to ask. I want to use the beauty today. So, how does the concept of the beauty manifest in Korean literature? Is it rooted a specific culture or aesthetical and philosophical tradition? And how does it differentiate itself from the Western literary conceptuations of the beauty?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. And actually, with this question, I have a much more personal opinion that can be that I can talk about in more straightforward terms. And I think the sub questions that you asked, there's a lot that we can ponder about. But personally, for me, just that from that simple question of what is beauty in Korean literature, it's to do with the Korean literary language. I think any literature from around the world, I think we all share, just in abstract terms, not culture-specific terms, we can have different ideas about what beauty is, and that's why there are scholars and departments, you study aesthetics, and I'm not going to go into that. But I think in that sort of the greater question of what is beauty in Korean literature, it's simply Korean literary language. And some people might think, well, Grace, isn't that kind of an obvious answer? I said yes, but, and I think with all literatures, people might say that, but specifically, I mean, my sort of view comes also from a very personal experience as well. So, I grew up between South Korea and the U.S., hence my accent. But I've been in Europe for probably the longest now. And I initially studied, my undergraduate degree was in French and comparative literature. And it was my comparative literature professor at the time who had the wisdom and the kind of insight, especially back then, it still is now, unfortunately, when comparative literature as a subject was very Eurocentric. The theories, it's very, theory-based, which I love theory. I love studying theory. I was one of those, strange students who just, yes, really took to theory. But my professor, and it was Professor Celeste Kang, who actually later became the president of the university where I studied at. And she said, it's very Eurocentric, and I just wondered, can you read Korean? And I said, yes. I've only had formal Korean education just at the right age. So between 9 till 12, I went to Korean school. All my other schooling was in the American and then later the British context. But I said that I can read Korean. She said, do you know Korean literature? I said, well, I know Korean literature, the Korean literature I studied at school when I was in primary and secondary school, but I don't know contemporary fiction. So she was the one who encouraged me, why don't you write an essay on Korean and from a comparative perspective, applying certain theories. And this was the day before online. So when I traveled to Korea, I went to the bookstore, I went to the library, I read, and what really captivated me, I was even at school, when I was at Korean school, I quite enjoyed studying Korean literature. I think it was one of my better subjects. 사회 was not. Too many details. I was never a very good history student because not very good at remembering details and years and things. But I think what really, even as a Korean, what struck me was I read various different novels and books, and the ones that I just what captivated me was what you might call just eloquently written, where the language had so much cadence. It's that cadence of well-written Korean prose. Just mesmerized me. So it wasn't just about the content and the theme, but it was the kind of writing, the literary works where the writing just was just mesmerized. I keep repeating that word. And it's the kind of language that, again, in Korea, you might call it lyricism, 서정적이다, Korean lyricism. And I say to my British friends who don't know Korean language or who are unfamiliar with Korean literature, I have to tell them, well, Korean is actually a phonetic, in terms of the written script, it's a phonetic script, because they initially think, oh, is it like Chinese? I said, no, they're not ideographs, it's like a phonetic system. And I think in all the writings, just the flow of it, if you read it out loud, just the way it sounds sometimes, at least the ones where, what I call great literature, and makes use of our language, the Korean language, in such a beautiful and clever way. And the language is so beautiful. But basically, the author becomes almost like a craftsperson, a creator, who turns like a piece of wood into something beautiful. But the material is there, it's there, into a beautiful piece of furniture or, an objet d'art. Right? And especially I think, with literature that makes use of colloquial language, expressions, in a way that really expresses what we might call, Korean day-to-day lives, cultural expressions, the things that make us laugh, even humor, or when you go to events and when someone talks about, when we have authors who give talks, and I've interpreted on many occasions, and we have Korean audiences, and we have audience members who don't know Korean, and then when the author says something really funny, and it's very using pure Korean expressions and things, and the Korean audience members laugh. The things that really sort of, as a people, we can relate to. And people would say, "Oh, it's difficult to translate. It's untranslatable, right?" But it's that kind of in a country where, for a long time, Korean was always spoken. But because the writing script, Hangul wasn't created until the mid-15th century. And so for a long time, it was classical Chinese was the written sort of language, but only exclusively available to a minority group of elite men, right? And I've studied Korean classical, literature, and I love it, but it's not quite the same as those that are written in the vernacular script, even when it comes to poetry, which essentially conveys the spoken language, the day-to-day, the kind of cultural heritage, the humor, the sort of tongue-in-cheek remarks, but also the beauty, and also just the sound. I think, personally, for me, above and beyond themes, topics, those are important too. But I think the Korean literary language is one that I think is essential to this notion of beauty in Korean literature.
Wow, it is quite moved.
I'm glad, yes, because it's both the sound, it's also when you read, but see, also visually,
Yeah, please
This is
talk about your stuff.
So this is a scarf by the eminent fashion designer Lee Sang-bong or Lee Sang-bong, and actually it was a gift from the Korean Cultural Center UK about 12 years ago, I think. But yes, it's written in Hangul, and I always wear this when there's an event related to Korean literature, or if there's because I think it's just visually as well. Speaking of audiovisual cultural content like film and animation media, but even just our script. And I think on Friday, you and I, when we met at the Olim exhibit opening, and we were mesmerized. We were very impressed by all the things. But one thing you noted was, but there's no Hangul script. And I think I mentioned, I was like, yes, there's like visually, it's also just beautiful. Which I can tell you, the UK members of I shouldn't say the UK audience in general terms, but my students or people, many British people I've spoken to who know Korean, they've like commented time and again about how they find the script. It looks very beautiful. Kind of interesting. It depends on the font as well. This is more like script. Other times they say it looks like circles and sticks, which they find interesting. Yes.
And when I talk about Korean aesthetics, always I start 훈민정음 because the language itself and the Hangul itself, and we can write our emotions with our own language.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So just when I was in 20s, I studied in Hanmun, classical Chinese text. Yeah, when I remember, but it's quite a totally different kind of language. It is almost impossible to express our subtle kind of emotions. But when we write in Korean language, it is Hangul, we can express our kind of subtle emotions. So now just when you say a kind of Hangul, it is the beauty, the starting point of beauty or the base of beauty. I am quite, it is really touching. This my old memories was a kind of, and just Grace, you have a kind of long time real research. Just you can conclude Hangul is one of the very important resource of Korean beauty or kind in Korean literature.
And also because, as I said, I just provided that personal, little anecdotal story about, because that's what actually got me to continue on with studying Korean literature after my undergraduate degree. Because yes, even though I knew Korean and even though I had studied Korean literature, but just kind of I fell in love with it all over again because of that. That's why. And that's kind of what basically brought me all the way here in terms of my career path.
And also, I like your kind of talk about like a sculpture of language. Yeah, like creators in literature is like a sculpture of the language.
Yes.
Yeah, it is really, that is the beauty. Yeah. Yeah. I want to move my third question.
Sure.
Yeah. It is vegetarian.
Yes.
Hangang. Yeah. It is our Hangang, and just in winning the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Yeah. It is after just Hangul날.
Mm.
Yeah, it is 10
That's right.
October.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
and October in the morning. We are quite surprised and really huge congratulations. So I just write my third question. Reflections on Hangang's Nobel win. With Hangang winning the 2024 Nobel Prize in Literature, Korean literature has reached a new milestone. What significance do you believe this achievement holds for Korean literature's global standing? How would you assess the impact of a win?
Yes. So first of all, yes, I think it's wonderful news, and I, congratulate the author Hangang very warmly. It was a delightful surprise. I think I don't really keep track of like when awards are going to take place and things. I only knew about the Nobel Prize for Literature being announced the date of it because I think the night before someone had emailed me asking if in the case that a South Korean author wins the Nobel Prize, please could I have an interview with you tomorrow? And I thought, oh, okay. So I looked it up. I was like, okay, they're going to announce it tomorrow at noon. I never replied to this person because in principle, I don't take interviews for media. I like to do these kinds of interviews or seminars, but so I hadn't been following. I don't usually follow awards and things. Only if I'm called upon to interpret, or if I hear of an announcement and things like that. And I remember just looking up very quickly the night before, checking up articles, and I remember there were other authors that were being predicted, and I think the UK media was basing their predictions on betting agencies. They have betting agencies. And then I was just looking through, and I think Hangang was listed at 33 to 1. And I remember thinking the day after, whoever bet on her must have made a lot of money. Sorry, I don't mean to. But but I remember thinking, oh, okay, this is very interesting. I wonder. And then I completely forgot about it again. And it wasn't until my sister-in-law from the States, actually, she messaged me. And I thought, oh my goodness. And then I got text messages from other people. I'd gotten lots of missed phone calls and the like. And so it was a delightful surprise. And I think it was probably one that many people were surprised, not because she's not a good writer or anything like that by any stretch of that. I think a lot of people felt like, but as one commentator, I think in the media said, it had particularly to do with the age. They said, maybe, she hadn't yet been sort of talked about as much because she's relatively young. And the Nobel Prize has a history of basically having more, sort of older writers, and also of a certain kind of profile as well. And so I remember reading an article where they were very positive about Hangang's win, but in terms of why they hadn't predicted her, firstly was to do with just her relative young age. So no one thought of it. Although they pointed out, well, actually Rudyard Kipling was 41 when he won, so he still remains the youngest. But I think 41 back then is probably like 53 in today's terms. But anyway, so I think it was just a delightful surprise, and I think there were many exactly, and I'm very happy for her. I think in the case of South Korea, I'm very aware. It's been a dream for Korea for a very long time now. And of course, Korea has always been in the way that, in the kind of the various trials and tribulations that, Korea, the Korean Peninsula, has faced over the past century. And with its kind of South Korea's rapid development, successes, the most dynamic country, the most progressive country in the world. But Koreans love to win, right? Love to win. I mean, who doesn't like to win? But I think also prizes, international acclaim is always something that Koreans have wanted, to the extent where I've read some very critical, even scholarly articles about how is this the right thing? Is it the right thing to become obsessed? Personally, for me, and I can speak for myself, it's always nice to hear about winners and news, but it's not something that I actively follow, as I said earlier, because I feel strongly that if there's a great work, great author, a time will come. But there's also, of course, politics involved and other factors. So there are many other great writers as well who are deserving, who may have never won in the past, who might not win. And I think sometimes that also becomes a difficult thing to talk about, right? To talk about, I think. And but I think, and I can't speak for Hangang, but I think as someone who teaches Korean literature, for example, and given Korea's the visibility of South Korea, the popularity of South Korean culture, and particularly the younger generation of students in the UK, because the vast majority of our students tend to be British. That's another question that I get asked quite frequently, and they're primarily British students who are more familiar with kind of contemporary fiction and things. But because they become interested through contemporary fiction, through contemporary popular culture, they want to know more, and they start reading older fiction. They start watching older movies that I used to think were poorly made. I watch it now with fresh eyes and think, wow, this is a classic, right? So I think in the same way that with Hangang's win, obviously, I'm mindful of the fact that there have been some criticisms of that, and perhaps it has to do with, again, age or lived experience. So, for example, if we talk about Korean historical traumas, much of like Han herself was kind of vicarious trauma, right? But it doesn't mean. But I disagree with the idea that just because you haven't lived through it like firsthand, that you can't write about it in a good way. And what I said earlier about the shared lived experience, and I think particularly as a Korean, and I can speak confidently from my own perspective, based on experience, with other Koreans, family, friends, etc. We all have that shared experience of historical trauma in one, in some shape or form, in the ways that our, great grandparents, grandparents, parents, and the succession of, the upbringing, the kind of lives, the struggles, and how that kind of shape our own sort of personal memories or post-memory, as Marian Hirsch's term with regard to the Holocaust, for example, post-memory. And we all share in that. And so I think that, personally, I think it's true that there are those who have actually lived through, some of the traumatic experiences. And of course, and among writers, we have a number of celebrated authors and poets who have, been imprisoned, tortured, in the age of, during the authoritarian regimes, who have suffered, but who continue to write about the grievances, that came out of a very difficult socio-political situation, and who wrote so eloquently and expressed. And I think it's because of all those authors who did so bravely that we have authors now who are able to carry on and also to write about. And it doesn't mean to say that it's fabricated. It's very much a shared experience in a different way, and kind of communicating them to different audiences and things. So I think that it's and personally, in terms of Hangang's writing, I think the way that she captures, as the Nobel Prize Committee said, it's just the human emotion, the kind of the ability to express the kind of lived humanity, basically, the lived experiences of humanity, and not necessarily based on firsthand experience, but even as a shared, kind of in a post-memory situation. But in order to kind of convey that, I think she has, a gift for that. But it doesn't mean to say that, she kind of emerged in a vacuum. I think it is kind of a collective, because there were, she's among just many others, who came before, who coexist, who are present. So I think in that regard, South Korea has much to be proud of, because it is kind of a collective, I think, representation. And it's not always an easy thing to talk about. And I think I told you on Friday, one of the reasons I don't like to talk about politics and, literature, and especially with spontaneous, because it gets very, I have lots of thoughts. I think there's a lot of perspectives that we have to take into account. And I think, but above all, I think it's wonderful that at least, South Korea, and also just from a gender point of view, woman, right? First Asian woman, to get it. So I think it's great. But I can't remember what exactly the specific subset questions you had, but I just wanted to kind of, I hope what I said sort of addresses some of the aspects that you mentioned. I think because some of the sub-questions you asked, I don't know how to answer them, because I'm not someone who necessarily puts importance on awards necessarily. But I think this is kind of recognition, not just for the individual author, but I think for kind of the Korean literary scene. And we have to remember that and be thankful.
I think this time is quite a kind of one of the crucial timings, because it is our kind of response is very vivid. Still we need time to kind of interpret what is the meaning of this Nobel Prize winning.
Yes, exactly.
And why the kind of Nobel Foundation talks about historical trauma. When they evaluate a kind of about Hangang. Why a kind of society talks about her age. Why she is the first woman in Asian Nobel Prize winner, and why it is from Korea, why it is not from China, not from Japan, and then still Hangang, just her theme is social, political, and themes. But still, her writing is very beautiful and very sensitive. Just we feel some kind of humanity, because she always, what she wanted to say is just to live. So her message is very clear, but she kind of start from the human beings is very fragile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, and I think it's coming from a place where, as I mentioned, I think she probably speaks to a generation who may not have gone through necessarily, not generation, but even audience members who may not have the lived experiences, but touches upon the frailty and the kind of torment, even in the aftermath of certain events, how that kind of carries on. Because I think that's something that she could probably, she is able to, because it's very much post-memory, but as she herself has said, has affected her in ways. But as a member of a society, of a community, of a country, of a nation, who are very much, I think all Koreans would say, yes, when it comes to shared, like, lived experiences of historical trauma, you know, the notion of Korean one people, the rise of kind of Korean nationalism was very much, I think, driven, especially in the 20th century, as a result of the kind of collective trauma that, you know, we encountered. And I use the word we, you know, my students always say, why is there so much uri, like we, our husband, our house, like, you know, our children, when you're talking from your perspective. But yes, so I think if we consider it in that way, no, absolutely, I think, and as for, I think there was one question just a friend asked me informally, and I think my answer was, well, you'd have to ask the Nobel Committee to, I'm not like, you know, I think it was in response to, they had read a critical article coming out from South Korea, one of, you know, critical article, and I said, well, you know, it's the Nobel Prize is very prestigious, but in terms of, they have their reasons, so journalists should ask them, not criticize, you know, the author who did, you know, who is just above all a beautiful writer, and it's just a shame that, you know, we have. I mean, it's just a shame that this was just our first. I think that maybe we could have had another couple in the past, you know. But no, but I think, you know, I think it's a great occasion to celebrate.
And also, just I think it is novel written in Korean language, Hangul. It is, if we have not so many Korean novels until 19th century, if we think from 20th century, we are kind of actively use Korean writing in Hangul.
Yes.
Only now this year is 2024. It means almost a kind of 100 years. It's just we a kind of Hangul get the Nobel Prize because other countries, German and French and English, they use a kind of just use English for many, just 100 years. Sure. French is same, German is same. But we just use the written system is classical Chinese text until 19th century. And then now only just 100 years, this 12 years, we kind of produced such a great and creativity. We see her novels in this global audience, so kind of really appreciate her. Yes. And her writing. Yes. Yeah, that is really, it is almost impossible. Yeah, on such a short time.
Sure. I agree with you, but I should point out, though, that because also my field, I've covered pre-modern literature. And I think, for example, if we look, there's so much literature prior to the 20th century that many Koreans haven't read. You know, there's only a fraction, right? And I remember when the first generation of modern Korean literary authors, such as Lee Kwang-soo, who wrote, you know, 문학이란 how, what is literature? And he was very critical of, you know, pre-modern literature because, you know, he essentially criticized it for being basically based on Chinese, like foreign. Now, his essay, though, did sort of, there was a double standard, though, because essentially the form of the novel was actually a Western form that traveled via Japan. But of course, it was so foreign, whereas, you know, classical Chinese and kind of Sinocentric kind of literary, not Sinocentric, Chinese literary conventions very much were were adapted and by Korean literati, for centuries. So we have a wealth of records written in classical Chinese, but we also have lots of vernacular Korean literary writings. And one of the things that I like to teach in my class is Lady Haegyong's memoir, The Hanjungnok. And if you read her memoirs, which was written in vernacular Korean, and even in English translation, reads like a modern, like a historical fiction. So much emotion. So when Lee Kwang-soo said there's no emotion, I said no, he hadn't yet discovered Hanjungno. So I think there was always the capacity. There were writers out there who did dabble, who did write. A lot of the vernacular poetry has a lot of sentiment. I take your point about it's to do with role models, right? It's about, and this is what writers like Lee Kwang-soo also talked about. It's like we have no role models for Korean literature. This is like this is the beginning of a new modern Korean literature. But I think there were probably, it's not that people weren't able. It's like any convention, even with literary conventions, we take for granted what a novel is, what a short story is. But we live in a time when they were developed, they evolved, they were here. So we think that it's existed forever, but it came from somewhere, right? But it doesn't mean to say that earlier authors didn't know how to write in this magnificent manner, expressing tongue and emotions and things. It's all to do, of course, as well as are they discovered? Are they canonized? Are they taught? Are they, right? So I think, Lady Haegyong, obviously, because of her stature and her status, that's why we know of her work. But I think that's one good example that, with Hangul, the ability to write in this eloquent way, to express such emotional depth, and to talk about actually people, human, like the kind of the relational aspects and such, in such a vivid manner, was always kind of there, but not sort of as fully realized. And then now, in the times that we live in the way that, of course, writing has developed and how authors have continued to basically be inspired by previous authors and also have practiced and developed their craft, I think is certainly, I agree, it's quite extraordinary. Yes.
I agree, because Korean literature has some Korean kind of emotional expression was still there, like 고려가요, like in Shijo, and some Hanjungnok, still some the kind of some root was a kind of in our subconsciousness, and a kind of absorb in our a kind of that. And something emotional or kind of resource is there.
Absolutely. And by women authors.
Yeah,
by women
authors.
poets.
Yeah.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, so maybe just I more kind of response.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like kind of her novel is like me, one or part of myself.
Yes.
Because some experience is quite similar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, she's continuing in the long line of tradition of women poetesses and authors who have written it. So I think it's good. It's good to also talk about it in that way as well, kind of contextually, historically.
Kang is a great novelist, but for the global audience, we have to talk about a kind of translations. Yeah, absolutely. Because the visibility owes to great translators.
Yes, absolutely.
The importance of translating literature, a message to DaeHwa Smith. Translation has played a pivotal role in bringing Korean literature to the world. As someone closely associated with literary translation, what message would you like to convey to Miss DaeHwa Smith, who translated Kang's work? Additionally, what advice would you offer to emerging scholars and translators dedicated to and translating Korean literature.
Thank you. Well, first of all, and I've said this many times before, but again, obviously, huge congratulations as well to Deborah, but also to my colleague and Anders Karlsson at SOAS, who, with his wife, they co-translated two of Han Gang's recent works into Swedish language, and of course. I think one of the criteria for to be nominated for the Nobel Prize, I don't know if they've changed it, but it used to be at least that the works have to be translated into Swedish language. So, yes.
4 to 6.
Right. Yes, that's right. But obviously to Deborah, because, with The Vegetarian and even afterwards with Human Acts and subsequent works, huge congratulations as well as a translator. Her role, obviously, as a translator has been pivotal, as I mentioned, along with the time of the London Book Fair. That was just an exciting period. I remember it was like a golden age, and she, along with her my other PhD and master's students at the time, we were all very just excited and became involved with events and things. And as ever, I've always been proud and continue to be proud of Deborah, always. And she's, I think she has extraordinary talent, very, very strong literary sensibilities. And some of you may already know, so, because she studied English literature at Cambridge University, avid reader, she self-studied Korean enough so that she had wanted to translate Korean literature, study Korean literature. And at the time, we used to have a separate degree. We have the MA Korean Studies at SOAS, but we also used to offer an MA in Korean literature. We no longer do, unfortunately. But for that one, you have to have advanced language. So she told me, she said, I've self-studied. So it was extraordinary because this was someone who, didn't know Korean. She self-studied and actually applied for the MA Korean Studies, which doesn't require Korean, language. It's more like area studies. So, but you can study language alongside it. But she self-studied enough so that she actually was placed at intermediate level when she came to us. So that was quite, so I think in a lot of the, people have asked, but in a lot of the BBC or other journals, they say that she just self-studied, period. I said, yes, she did. That's how she started. But she did come and study at SOAS, by the way. So she was studying intermediate Korean, but she took also, classes literature and then later translation. There was a module called Readings in Korean Literature, which she did when she was doing her PhD. She studied. So just a really gifted linguist, but also, first and foremost, in terms of just a gift for writing and strong literary sensibilities, was remarkable. And she also knew the importance of learning the language, Korean language. So in spite of, misunderstandings by some, no, she did study Korean language very diligently, and I think she was very gifted, kind of a language learner, and was just remarkable in the way that, in terms of, there are a lot of kind of question marks around what faithfulness is. And in translation studies, for example, some people tend to think faithfulness means one thing, but there's not a consensus among translators or translation studies. Some people think faithfulness has to do with linguistic, faithfulness. There's a whole disciplinary field because of this, and there have been lots of prominent, theorists, linguistics, translation studies who have discussed this in relation to sort of. Is faithfulness kind of linguistic accuracy, word for word content, or is it more to do with functional theory? It has to do with the target, language function. And I think literary translation as well, there are yet again very different approaches and views. And, Deborah has her own sort of methodology. And I've always very much kind of admired and supported. And when students come to study translation or literature, they expect us to teach. And the first thing I say in class is, you cannot teach translation. And I know there are people out there who would disagree with me, but that's my approach. I say, I cannot teach you how to translate, because each and every one of us, like each and every individual author, is a different writer, is a different type of translator. We have different backgrounds. We have different levels of understandings, knowledge, training, et cetera, et cetera. Translation classes are not language classes. And the second thing I said, this is not a language class. You already have to come in equipped with, the ability to language it. It's more about talking about the issues surrounding translation. And there are disagreements, and that's okay, because every one of us has our strengths and weaknesses. And also, even if you're a good, wonderful translator for one author and one work, does not mean that you will necessarily be the best translator for a different author or different work. It's like every translator has their own author, kind of a certain kind of, it's a relationship, and it's a certain kind of sensibility. And I remember in the case of DaeHwa, she, in the earlier times, she's one of the most diligent people I have known. And she translated lots of different samples of authors. I think at first she was kind of finding her voice, so to speak, of different authors, and she submitted pieces and things. And Kang was someone that they kind of meshed together, and it worked. And it worked. And then subsequently, there were other authors. I think she also translated DaeHwa. So I think with translators, they find their author who they mesh with. And it doesn't mean to say that it was a fluke for her, because as I said, she worked very hard. But so we've always been very proud of her. And not just DaeHwa, but I think there was a whole coterie of postgraduate students at the time who I've just been blessed having wonderful students. And if I may, I feel like, I think with this, because DaeHwa emailed me a couple days after the news of the of the announcement, and I think around that time there were other students, a coterie, who also went off to publish, to become published translators. And there's people like Sophie Bowman, who's currently at University of Toronto, but she won, I think, prizes in Korea. And she's translated short fiction and poetry. I think her course is there, and was a close friend of DaeHwa's. And Victoria Caudle, who did her undergraduate studies in Korean with us, and she's also very active kind of translator. And Matsu Mandersloot and Vivian Overas, two students whose first language are Dutch and Norwegian respectively, but they came to SOAS and working with different languages, but they've received prizes for translations in their native languages. And I think Vivian actually did the Norwegian translation of Human X, I think, or Vegetarian, which was also acclaimed. And then Alan Simpson, whose works we're trying to get him to publish, but they were by the works of Kim Hena. And they were kind of a really, not all of them, but particularly Sophie, I think it was Alan. And then there was some Korean, slightly older 언니들. 경수 Kim, 미영 Kim, 편정심, 좀 Korean 언니들 who were doing MA Korean literature, who really looked after them as well, especially when they went over to Korea. 먹여주고 재워주고, always supportive. And I think also it's that kind of, you need a community. And of course, DaeHwa also went off to find her, also connect with other translators. She founded the Tilted Access Press, which was very impressive while she was doing her PhD. I always thought she was, as we say in Korean, 학교에 가기는 좀 아까운 것 같아요. I thought, she was too good to be just have an academic career. I felt like actually there's a whole other sort of area that, and I was going to have a talk with her about that. Not that she was a brilliant scholar as well, but I just felt, gosh, like to be in academia is not like necessarily a great thing. And I still remember I was going to have lunch with her and I was going to just ask, what she thought. And she said, oh, by the way, I studied for, you have to have a certain certificate if you want to like start a publishing company in the UK. So she took a course from the British Library. She says, so I took this course and I'm thinking of, founding a publisher and I kind of want to go this route. And I was so proud. I was like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. You've already done it. So, she continued in that field and really contributed, not only, obviously for Korean literature, but also just, world literature and translation in general. And although she stepped down from her role in Tilted Access Press, she still, I think, is involved just as kind of an honorary member. But she established that particular publisher's company. It's small but very critically acclaimed, and they've published lots of books from Asia, South Asia, from around the world, contemporary fiction. So what some people might think are obscure, you wouldn't know, but people who have a very good knack, like Deborah, of kind of knowing, as one of her class cohorts say, yeah, she has a very good eye and a very good sense of certain literatures that she feels is really relevant to serious sort of literary fiction readers of the new generation. And she really did have that. Yeah. So, we've always been very proud of her. And I use the word we because it's not just me, it's like this whole group. Yeah. And also her other like professors and teachers, at SOAS, but also even her kind of cohort, her family, her kind of literary family. And she's gone on to create her own. So very proud of her, yeah.
Wow, it is very special friendship. It is more than the special friendship. Very meaningful connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It is person to person, and just Korea to UK.
Absolutely.
And literature, literary to literary, or society or literature to literature.
Yes.
I think they create a very different kind of stage of Korean culture, and also just a literary. And yes. Yeah, just it is very great on neither.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think, I kind of went on about, or gave you some sort of anecdotes, because it kind of connects with one of the questions you asked about what would I say to, is it future translators or young people who maybe, want to. And I always say, because now in recent years, I've gotten, from time to time, I'll get emails from students who contact me because they're interested in doing a PhD in Korean literature. And what's interesting is 20 years ago, occasionally I used to get emails from, prospective candidates who had done, 2 PhDs, 2 MAs, but didn't know Korean language. And back then, they were more interested in Korea for its history, or they had particular interest for Korea. And I would have to convince them, well, no, you need you need to know, the language. Oh, but can I work with translated fiction? And translation fiction at the time was mostly through university presses, so it was like 20th century literature, very socio-politically engaged, and they were wanting to study it from that kind of perspective. And I would say, well, maybe no, And then it was quiet for a while, and then we had some wonderful students. And more recently, I've been getting the same kind of requests. So I'd like to do a PhD involving Korean literature. I come from an English literature background, or comparative literature background. Do you know Korean? Oh, I've been self-studying. So I was thinking, okay, how is your Korean? Oh, I said, well, if you want to do a PhD, you either have, no, I said, if you don't know the Korean language. No, because even Deborah, she had to start from at a master's level. She took some time. She went off. She went to Korea. Did that. I said absolutely not, and it kind of made me think. I said it's not to discourage you, but it's more, especially if they're interested in academia. Lots of competition, and then I would always say, well, think of it this way: if a Korean person said they're doing English studies but didn't know English, that would be laughable, right? And I think that's when people kind of realize, oh yes, of course. But what it made me realize was. And I'm always happy to meet with people, to tell them, not to discourage them, but to tell them it's an investment. You should do this, you should do that. There's some fantastic programs in Korea. You have to invest your time and then come back. I would love to see you, but you need to do that. But then I was getting more and more inquiries like this. And I was like, what is this? And it made me realize, especially with the contemporary fiction that is being translated today, it reads so naturally that readers forget. See? So these young readers forget, like, oh gosh, it's kind of for a different reason in the way that, people came to me 20 years ago. They looked at it as kind of a study object. It was very much, through looking at literature to study Korean history, politics, socioeconomic situations in the 20th century, et cetera, looking at it as kind of an artifact of sorts. But this new generation, I think the quality of, translations in Korean fiction, and also because they're available through mainstream publishers and bookshops. And you mentioned that title with "I Want to Eat Tteokbokki and Die." Yes, like you go to W.H. Smith. I saw that once in an airport, and I thought, "Is that?" And I read about it. So it's done in such a kind of a way that even target text like language readers almost forget, right? That there is a Korean author, and it was first written in Korean language. I'm sure they didn't forget, but it's because of that. And I think that's extraordinary, and I think it does well. Now, in terms of translators, increasingly we get a lot of students coming in, and they often cite Deborah as being like an inspiration, which is wonderful. And I always say, yes, I'll definitely let her know. I think it's great. And there will be people who will say, yes, I'd like to work as a translator. 10 years ago, no, because what if I don't succeed? Or 어떻게 먹고 how am I going to afford to live? But a younger generation, actually, including Deborah, money's not, like, as long as they have a roof over their head, as long as they can kind of live, they want, all the students that I've just mentioned, the same mentality. I just want to be able to have a roof over my head, live day to day. This is my passion. Right, and then you have like the other people who DaeHwa, I'll help you, right? So, and I should also mention Brother Anthony of Taizé, who's also a wonderful person in Seoul, who would always also support and help young translators. But anyway, and I would always say to translators or prospective translators, so let me ask you, why do you want to be a translator, literary translator? Sometimes people just want to do it for the success of it, or it's interesting. I said, okay, that's great. And my advice is always, what should I do? How can I prepare? I said, I'm really sorry to say this because people want certain answers. For the question of how do I become a good translator, there's nothing anyone can teach you. Rule number one, you just have to be an avid reader. Like a lot of the successful translators were avid readers who read constantly since childhood. With all my former students, they're good translators because they have strong literary sensibilities. It's not just about the linguistic knowledge. It's really about, you can only learn through kind of also, the books are your best teacher in some ways, And practice, practice, practice. You know, don't expect to be perfect. Make mistakes. That was another thing. DaeHwa was really good. She came reading some Korean literature class. She audited it as a PhD student. Students who were actually there for credit, they were shy because I would have students read out their translation. People are shy. She would just raise her hand. She would make mistakes, but that's how you learn. You have to put yourself out there. You make mistakes. You say, okay, that's really good. This was an error. You know, right? You can't expect to produce something perfect, you know, first round. So just read lots, write lots, practice. That's like that's as much as I can say, really.
And then read a lot and write a lot.
Yes.
And then
There's no shortcut.
Yeah, there is no shortcut.
No.
Yeah. My fifth question is Korean literature in the digital age, future and innovation. As we navigate the digital era, how do you see Korean literature adapting to new technologies, from interactive texts and to digital storytelling trend like a text hip? How do you envision the future of Korean literature and for the next generation? And what innovations do you expect to see in the field?
I think these are really interesting points and an interesting question. I think my answer is short because it's an area that I'm not familiar with at all. I feel ashamed. Well, no, I don't feel ashamed. It's like I have lots of other things to do. I think it's exciting. It's an area that I'm not familiar with. So I can't necessarily speak to it in the way that some others who are involved, who have more knowledge of kind of digital, you know, literature. I remember on Friday you mentioned text tip, and I was like, "What is that?" You know? And even as you explained it, I still haven't quite grappled what that is. And I joke to my current students, undergraduates, because actually for undergraduate dissertations, I noticed in recent years we have more and more undergraduate dissertations on webtoons. And I supervise them because, you know, you can supervise just general kind of content. And I always tell them, I'm afraid I can't help you with the actual content. So I learned from my students so much, you know, if not more than sometimes what my students learn from me. But so I was aware of all these just really like interesting new developments in kind of digital platforms and things. The only extent of kind of knowledge that I had about digital literature, I don't know if that's the term, is the correct term, was I think about 10, 15 years ago when I used to convene the MA Comparative Literature program at SOAS. And we have a wonderful group of academics, you know, in literary studies who study literatures from, you know, Asia, so East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, near Middle East, Africa. So it's just a wonderful community, and we learn so much from each other. And so with the comparative literature course, it was basically inviting different colleagues. And I remember one, Professor Michel Hux, who's a prominent scholar in modern Chinese literature. He's now in, I think, in Indiana University. But he was at the time talking about electronic literature. And I remember it was like the big thing. And I remember I was really mesmerized. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And I remember him asking me, oh yeah, doesn't Korean literature, you know, this is when Samsung and was on the rise, and he was asking, I don't think there's much in Korea. He kind of had a look. I said, yeah, I don't think this is a thing. But whereas in China, in Chinese literature, I think e-literature was like the big trend at the time. But what was interesting, of course, is that it's all URL, but then the URLs would either get scrubbed or changed. And he said the only challenge with that is, unlike physical books, once it sort of somehow disappears, it disappears. So that was the extent that I knew. But now, like, there's all sorts of things that are happening, and I think it's quite exciting. I think there will be the question of and I mentioned electronic literature because it was the same kind of questions that were being raised with regard to the kind of simpler, compared to what's happening now, form, was the question of, to what extent can we say, where are the boundaries of literature? Do we call it literature once it starts kind of morphing into making use of certain digital technologies? In the case of webtoons, because a lot of it also relies upon sort of animation alongside text. So there are all these interesting questions about how to define literature, especially as they developed alongside technology and digitally. So I don't know. I don't think I'll necessarily be involved in actively studying, because I've got my own projects, but it'd be interesting to see what happens. And I don't doubt that Korea will be at the forefront, especially having seen recently the exhibition at the Sashi Gallery, the Olim, and what Korea does with media technology, and just the pace at which things develop and how people pick up on things. So yes, I it's all very exciting. But personally, for me, I'd be interested to see. The question that I'll probably be asking is, how does that? Can we define this as literature, and if so, in what way? Yes, because it also affects kind of my profession as well, right? What do we teach in literature departments, right? So, and I remember once, 10 years ago, people used to say, oh, literature is dead now, it's all cinema. I was like, no, literature will never die. Because, in the dystopian world where you have no plugs, if you have something to write with and something to write on, that will survive when technology even might die one day or evolve in certain ways.
Thank you so much for your great insight from what is Korean literature and what is the kind of beauty of Korean literature, and then our Nobel Prize Kang and a kind of great translator and DaeHwa Smith in collaboration, and our new future of our Korean literature. It is a very long history. History of art, history of culture, but it is obvious thing is this is in Korean culture now. Yeah, it is amazing Korean culture now.
Yes.
Everything happened at the same time. Nobel Prize and digital literature and webtoon. Then this is I can say we live in quite exciting time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I am quite happy to share just our ideas and opinions and some feelings, and then it is quite special. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I may, sorry, one thing that I also would like to mention, if I may, is I mentioned like the role of Korean organizations such as the LTI Korea, the KCC UK, the Arts Council. But I just want to reiterate as well, I think, and this is from the point of view of colleagues, as well as Deborah mentioned, fellow literary translators working on English translation of Japanese literature, Chinese literature, other literatures. People are really, envious and enamored by the fact that South Korea, and specifically the government, is very invested in providing, financial support or other types of support, and support in a way where they don't dictate too much. I think that was something that Deborah mentioned is, LTI Korea funds, they facilitate, but they don't dictate content or things compared like to other institutions of other countries. And we just took it for granted. But I think that also, that's something that we can't ignore, and it does play a significant role. And I'm not being promoted by the government or anything. I'm not a very political person. But so I say this like in all honesty and frankness, and from seeing the kind of level of support that we've received, to be able, because there's always talent. There's a lot of talented authors around the world, but we live, the reality is that you need these kinds of support in order for talent to be discovered and promoted and to be sustained and maintained. And about 10, 15 years ago, people used to wonder, is this a fluke? Is the Korean wave, is it just going to be like a fluke and then it'll die down? But no, it's just continued. And I think we also have to realize that those kinds of backing and support, some people are very cynical about it, they're critical, but we can't ignore that. And I think we're very fortunate to have it, for better or worse. Again, I can hear some voices. And also other not just governmental, but like in the case of DaeHwa, she was a recipient of the Korea Foundation Scholarship, which is, of course, kind of government funded, but also other foundations like the ICF, which is the International Communication Fund, which was run by the Seunghye. And they actually supported, it was merit-based, so she applied and things, but they actually provided a great deal of financial support during her, postgraduate studies. And without that, she has said that I wouldn't be able to just live, because she was like many British students at the time, at least, postgraduate students didn't receive support from family. So had to heavily rely on scholarships and funding, and all those funding came from Korea. So ICF was also Korean, and so I think it's also a testament to what Korean says, 국력. 국력. It's a talent there, but also those kinds of support are very important and crucial, and it's something that colleagues around me, frequently say, wow, I think you're very fortunate. And I say, yes, I think we are. And also I'm very proud it's moments like these when I'm very proud to be Korean. Yes, so, yes, I just wanted to add that, if I may.
Oh,
yes.
Thank you so much for your great words. I think it is a great conclusion of our today's talking. And thank you so much for the audience just to participate in our dialogue. And after just to watch these videos, I recommend you to read more. Yeah,
absolutely.
And then if you just have some more passion, you can write more, and we can create better our stories of our life. Yeah, thank you so much for everyone. And thank you so much, Grace, your great time and passion for sharing your kind of ideas today.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you. I enjoyed the conversation, your comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.